A very tall son named Barron. Has anyone ever heard of him?
Presidents are often remembered for wars, elections, and the big ideas that shaped the nation. But their family lives tell a story that's just as revealing. The number of children each president had ranges from none at all to a staggering total that sounds like a trivia trick, yet is absolutely real. 0 children.
90% of them are going to regret not having children. You know, there's a series of biological switches that go off in a person's life. You know, becoming an adult, being on your own, becoming self-sufficient, finding an occupation, finding groups of friends and community, and having a family. There's a thing that people, they do, and they become a different thing because of that.
5 presidents had no known biological children, and their stories show that leadership and legacy don't always pass through a direct bloodline. George Washington never had biological children, likely due to illness earlier in life. Yet his home at Mount Vernon was lively because he raised Martha's Custis children and helped her guide her grandchildren. He functioned as a patriarch without the legal language of adoption that would come later. James Madison had no biological children, but his marriage to Dolley created a blended home centered on her son from her first marriage, John Payne Todd. Their story contains quieter domestic moments alongside Dolley's famous social poise that set the style of early White House entertaining. Andrew Jackson likewise had no kids, yet he took in wards and orphans and acted as a guardian. His home at the Hermitage was full of young voices, a reminder that households could be built by duty as well as kinship. James K. Polk presents a different picture. He and Sarah Polk had no children and did not maintain a bustling wardship network. It gave the Polk home a sense of order that matched his tireless work habits. James Buchanan, the only lifelong bachelor president, relied on his niece, Harriet Lane, as White House hostess. She became a popular figure in her own right, proving a presidential household could command attention without a traditional family structure. 1 to 3 children. Harry Truman had one daughter, Margaret, whose public life ranged from music to writing. Warren Harding had a daughter, Elizabeth Ann Britton, whose paternity was disputed for decades until DNA evidence confirmed the relationship long after his death. President Clinton's single child, Chelsea, grew up on a global stage and then crafted an impressive adult life that feels recognizable to viewers who saw her childhood play out in the news. Dwight Eisenhower had 2 sons, though heartbreak shadowed the story because one died in early childhood. Richard Nixon's 2 daughters, Tricia and Julie, became front-page figures in the television era with White House weddings and carefully staged photo moments. Lyndon Johnson's 2 daughters, Linda and Lucy, moved through the 60s inside the most visible home in America, while George W. Bush and Barack Obama modeled the small, close family that many viewers saw as the new normal. Beyond the television age, the 2-child count also describes Millard Fillmore, William McKinley, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Coolidge lost his teenage son to blood poisoning, an event that cast a long shadow over his presidency. McKinley and Ida endured the loss of both daughters, and Ida's fragile health became part of the family's ongoing story. Woodrow Wilson had 3 daughters who stepped into public life in different ways, including hosting duties that defined the social rhythm of his administration. William Howard Taft's son Robert became a towering figure in mid-century Senate politics. They had 3 children. Other 3-child families include Franklin Pierce, Chester Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, and James Monroe. Monroe's era gave the nation one of its most talked-about White House weddings, while Harrison's family later added a child in a second marriage, creating a cross-generation portrait that was unusual for a former president. 4 to 6 children. John Quincy Adams had 4, extending one of the earliest political dynasties. Ulysses S. Grant had 4, and his family traveled through an extraordinary afterlife of fame as he and Julia toured the world following their White House years. Gerald Ford's 4 children helped define the relaxed, instantly familiar tone of the mid-1970s presidency that arrived after a national crisis. Jimmy Carter's 4 rooted the family in Georgia values that remained visible long after the term ended. This bracket also includes Abraham Lincoln's 4 sons, a story heavy with loss. Eddie died before the war, Willie died in the White House, and Tad died in his youth not long after the assassination. The personal grief inside the Lincoln home is impossible to miss once you look at the numbers. At the high end of this bracket stand families with 6 children, including John Adams, Martin Van Buren, Zachary Taylor, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and George H.W. Bush. These are households that poured into American memory through photographs, letters, and a long list of careers. The two Roosevelt families alone seemed to fill a century with names and anecdotes. Theodore's children included adventurers and soldiers, and Alice's wit made her a celebrity. Franklin and Eleanor's 6 children wove through journalism, politics, and service, creating a continuous thread of public presence. John Adams's 6 remind us that the nation's early political families also weathered illness, distance, and the strains of duty. Van Buren's 6 reflect a country moving west, and Taylor's 6 belong to a military family that turned frontier experience into national leadership. 5 children sit in the middle of this range. Andrew Johnson had 5, with tragedies and difficulties that unfolded alongside Reconstruction politics. Grover Cleveland had 5, with Frances, and their family fascinated a public that could not look away from the novelty of a young First Lady. In the 21st century, Donald Trump's 5 children created a wide network of public images, from boardrooms to campaign rallies. 7 or more.
So when I was in 2nd grade, I proudly stood up and told the entire class, Thomas Jefferson is my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And the teacher said, sit down and stop telling lies. Of course, the whole class laughed, and I was devastated about it.
7 or more children belongs to an earlier rhythm of American life. James A. Garfield had 7, and after his assassination, the nation grieved with Lucretia and the children who guarded his memory. Rutherford B. Hayes had 8, producing a portrait of a 19th century home with bustle, heartbreak, and proud service. William Henry Harrison had 10, anchoring a family line so wide that his son, John Scott Harrison, stands as the only person who was both the child of a president and the father of another. Thomas Jefferson requires careful attention in this range. He had 6 children with his wife, Martha, and extensive scholarship and DNA evidence strongly support that he fathered additional children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello. Their descendants carried that story forward, placing Jefferson's private life within the realities of slavery and the shadow it cast over American families. The likely total raises the practical count of Jefferson's biological children far above the official 6 that appear on many lists. Large families remapped the sound of the White House and the homes that fed into it. In the Harrison clan, the branches reached into future presidency. In the Hayes and Garfield homes, the sounds of lessons, chores, and celebrations were mingled with grief that was far more common in that era. This brings us to the final spotlight, where the family count reaches 15. John Tyler, America's most prolific president.
Now some fun facts about John Tyler. He was the latter half of a famous campaign slogan. The first vice president elevated to the presidency on the death of the chief executive. The first president to marry in the White House in 1844. And 174 years later, 2 of his grandchildren are still around.
John Tyler became president in 1841. He had 8 children with his first wife, who died while he was in office. At 52, he married 22-year-old Julia Gardner. They had 7 children, for a total of 15, the most of any president.
John Tyler holds the record with 15 children, a number that sounds like folklore until you follow the dates and names. Born in 1790, Tyler belonged to the generation after the founders, trained as a lawyer, and rose through Virginia politics. He became vice president in 1841 and president soon after William Henry Harrison died, the first time a vice president took the office upon a president's death. Tyler's political fights with the Whigs and his role in setting the precedent for succession shaped his reputation. But the hum of his home tells another story. With his first wife, Letitia Christian Tyler, he had 8 children. She died in the White House, the first presidential wife to do so. 2 years later, he married Julia Gardner, a much younger New York socialite whose style and confidence energized Washington society. With Julia, he had 7 more children. The Tyler line produced one of the most startling time bridges in presidential history. Leon Gardner Tyler, John's son with Julia, fathered children later in life, and one of those sons, Harrison Ruffin Tyler, lived until 2025. That means a grandson of a man born in the 18th century was alive in the 21st. Now it's time to hear from you. Did the record of 15 children surprise you? Let us know in the comments section below.